Vincent Lloyd is professor of Christian ethics and theories and methods of culture at Villanova University, where he is also director of Africana Studies. He's the author of 5 books, a 6th one coming, the editor of 6 books, and the author of many, many journal articles and book chapters. He's also the founder of the Political Theology Network and editor of 2 important book series. In a remarkably brief period of time, Professor Lloyd has become an intellectual leader and one of the most influential writers in the fields of political theology, Black theology, and Africana studies. His writings have vastly expanded the canon in political theology and Black theology to include public figures, educators, performing artists, and poets. At the same time, Professor Lloyd has carried out a sustained interrogation of the secular in politics and in Black and Africana thought, discerning implicitly religious themes in ostensibly secular thinkers and movements, and identifying what has become obscure or inaccessible with the denial of the sacred. As with Simone Weil, Professor Lloyd's work ranges over an astonishingly wide range of topics, crosses numerous disciplinary boundaries, and takes the form of multiple genres. Also like Weil, Professor Lloyd treats topics covered by philosophers and theologians, yet with careful attention to the social, cultural, literary, and performative aspects of ideas and concepts, resulting in rich and strikingly original interpretations of authors, figures, and texts. Once again, like Weil, Professor Lloyd's writings are permeated both in content and in form by a commitment to justice. In his case, to an apophatic moral vision that acknowledges the ultimate inaccessibility of the human person to concepts, a non-representability that reflects the ultimate non-representability of God, whom human beings image. And finally, like Weil's work, Professor Lloyd's is always illuminating and always thought-provoking, but never predictable. For all of these reasons, it is a great honor for me to introduce him to the American Weil Society. Please join me in welcoming him as our keynote speaker.
I thought it would be a challenge to follow the music, and then I am compared to Simone Weil at the Weil Society. I think I don't know what I can say after that, but thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thanks to Anne and Jane for the invitation and making such a complicated conference possibility, even in these uncertain times, and to, of course, all of the staff who've been working so hard to allow us to converse across time zones and countries and within the room as well. And thanks to all of you, hybrid, virtual, in person, for being here on this rainy day. And of course, to my Notre Dame theology and Africana studies friends who come out, it's always great to see you and be in conversation with you. South Bend is a city where I've lived for 2 years and always enjoy the opportunity to come back to. The Notre Dame campus is one where I feel oddly, I guess, at home. I haven't quite figured out why that is, but walking around the campus, it feels not only familiar, but comforting in a way. I'm still reflecting on that. I think I have some ambivalent feelings about that feeling, but and of course, thanks to the American Weil Society, which I think models excellence in disciplinary association gatherings, a group that I've seen here rooted in a rigorous and deep reflection on one figure, on Simone Weil, but also just as importantly, welcoming to new scholars and to established scholars whose work is adjacent to the society, who have an interest in Weil, stretching conversations about Weil in various directions, and a society that welcomes some provocation. I don't think I'll be too provocative tonight, but I hope to embrace that spirit of stretching conversations about they in new directions. This is actually my third American They Society colloquy. I realized the first one was maybe 13 or 14 years ago, and I was sort of tracking my own intellectual development through these different topics. I was talking about Althusser and ideology maybe 13 or 14 years ago, and then maybe 5 years ago talking about epistemic injustice and feminist philosophy and Simone Weil, and today thinking about they in Black thought, a topic I've been reflecting on in recent years. And I should say, although I've been here a couple of times in past years, I'm not a they expert. I don't know the canon like the back of my hand, like many colleagues in the room here who have such an impressive expertise on they's thought. And I'm excited to be in conversation with you all and to be learning from you all this evening. It's hard to know exactly how to calibrate remarks to this society, given that this society has such a dynamically mixed audience, those who've been thinking about they for so long and those who are bringing their own work into conversation with they. So I'm going to try and try not to dwell too deeply on the familiar, but also to say enough about topics that are well known in they that provide some point of reference for those who are just joining the conversation. And I should also say, by way of apology, I'm a bit out of this routine of going to places and giving talks. There was a two-year break, right, where there wasn't a lot of travel, so I may have some more ums and stumbles than I'm used to here. But thanks for your indulgence. When Anne initially approached me about speaking here, we had a bit of a back and forth exchange about a topic. We both had similar ideas. It was almost miraculous that we were thinking along similar lines. We were thinking about they's Homer and the Homer that appears in Black thought, in Black literature and Black intellectual work. And so that was the topic I sort of started with and was thinking about over the last few months. And in fact, there's, as you know, a good deal of writing on they's Homer, and as you may know, an increasing amount of writing on Homer's role in Black thought. It struck me that there may be some interesting similarities here, perhaps in the reading methods that are employed, perhaps in the substantive interpretations that arise. But as I'll explain in a minute, I had to switch paths. To say a bit for those unfamiliar about this recent interest of Homer in the context of Black thought, it comes in three groups. One of these groups has to do with recovery of Black classicists, realizing that there have been scholars of classical antiquity who were African-American and Caribbean and African for many years, many decades. Their work has often not been appreciated. They were marginalized within their disciplines, within the history of the discipline. And so one set of this literature is recovering such figures. Another set has to do with the prehistory of race. What does it mean to think about ethnic distinctions or something like racial classifications, although there's always analogy and stretch in the term when we look at antiquity. But it's the third category that I'm most interested in, or was initially most interested in, that is the influence of Homer on Black literature. This may seem surprising at first, but with a little reflection, we'll notice that it may be less surprising. The most famous piece of literature here is called Homeros by Derek Walcott, the Nobel Prize-winning Caribbean poet. This is a very long, 300 plus page poem that is drawing on, engaging with figures, concepts, places from the Homeric epics and placing them within a Caribbean and African context, using that framework from Homer to tell stories about the Black Caribbean experience. But if we think further, we may remember Aimé Césaire's Notebook of a Return to a Native Land, which scholars have pointed to the connections with the Odyssey that are throughout this text, another long poem. Even Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's cornerstone of African-American literature. There's now a growing set of secondary literature that looks at Ellison's own investment in the classics, in Greek and Latin literature, and the role of the Odyssey in particular in shaping that classic Black text. For those who are interested in more, Justine McConnell's book, Black Odysseys, tracks some of this. Patrice Rankin's Ulysses in Black, Emily Greenwood's Afro-Greeks with a Caribbean focus tracks this emerging literature. That phrase Afro-Greeks comes from a poem by Derek Walcott, and it refers to this peculiar British education that so many Black Caribbean folks in the early and mid 20th century had, an education in Greek and Latin literatures that led Walcott to understand himself and his cohort as Afro-Greeks. Of course, there's also a geographical connection with the Caribbean sense of a place that is defined by islands in the sea and all that goes with that, the shifts, the fluidity, the sense of land that goes with such a geographical context. Greenwood goes into some detail looking at the archives of school records and of the men, and in many cases as well, women who were trained in the classics in the British Caribbean school systems. Their tests went to the UK for grading, and so they're fascinating records there. McConnell looks at South Africa, South America, and Black folks elsewhere, including the US, to track the way that the Homeric texts were of influence in those contexts. In all of these works, there's a sense that Black readers of Homer were both joining and challenging a Western heritage, asking, what does it mean to call certain works part of a Western canon? How could that canon be expanded? Could the meaning of the works in that canon be different if they were read by an expanded group of scholars and students, bringing their own concerns to those texts? There's also a sense of imitation with a difference in these readings of the Homeric texts, not just displacing the Homeric stories into a Caribbean or Black American or South African context, but playing with the language, playing with the sense of place, with the personalities to transform and perhaps subvert meanings that were found in those original texts. This may lead us to ask, right? Is this what Weil is doing? Is she reading these Homeric texts from her context with her interests, from a different kind of marginal position? Well, the problem that I encountered is that these texts in the Black traditions are focused on engagements with the Odyssey. And as readers of Weil know, she doesn't have a very high opinion of the Odyssey. It's the Iliad that for her is the paradigmatic Homeric text. Now, we may think Derek Walcott is a bit of an exception here. The final chapter of Omeros begins in a kind of parody of the opening of the Iliad. Walcott says, I sang of quiet Achille, Apholab's son, who never ascended in an elevator, who had no passport, since the horizon needs none, never begged nor borrowed, was nobody's waiter, whose end, when it comes, will be a death by water. But Walcott himself, reflecting on his education, says he actually never read the Iliad. He only read little bits of it. He read the Odyssey. That was the book that sort of formed him and formed his writing. He just took bits and pieces of the Iliad where they seemed like they would be useful in his storytelling in Omeros. Césaire, Ellison, and others draw on the Odyssey in their telling of their Black retellings of Homer. They describe the Odyssey as inferior she treats it as an unworthy text. She writes, quote, "The Odyssey seems only a good reproduction of the Iliad in some places. The Iliad," she writes, "is, quote, the only true epic that the West possesses." It just goes downhill from there. So I wondered, why is it that Black writers favor the Odyssey and they favors the Iliad? And I wanted to reflect on that question, or use that question as a starting point, and wonder whether it might have something to do with Weil's reading of the Iliad as teaching us that we are all slaves. What would it mean to conclude that we are all slaves from a Black American or global Black context? Is something lost about the particular experiences of Black writers if this is the message of the Iliad, at least as Weil puts it forward? And this question, are we all slaves, seems somewhat abstract, but is also fundamental. It has these deep philosophical and theological issues packed into it, issues that are underscored by Weil, but already there in the tradition or the traditions themselves. If there's something slave-like about the human condition, what distinguishes people who are actually enslaved, literally enslaved, physically enslaved? How are we to think about that question? More generally, if the impact of slavery falls disproportionately on some people and not on others, in its reality and in its legacy, right, in its afterlives, right, then does the language of all of us being slaves in some way have political force, or does it cause political problems, ethical problems, philosophical problems, descriptive problems? And in 2022 in the US, with the question of anti-Black racism on many minds, this question seems all the more pressing. There's also a theological version of this question. If aspiring to a slave-like in some sense relationship to God instead of a slave-like in some sense relationship to worldly powers is desirable, then what does it mean? What does that mean for those who are actually enslaved? Right? What does it mean to desire a slave-like relationship to God if you're already enslaved? Of course, there are biblical sort of textual issues involved here, and all sorts of theological conundrums that grow out of that. I just want to point to the significance of this issue. One might say, well, this slave-like is being used metaphorically here, but there certainly is a sense of obedience, obedience in cases where one can never fully discern the reasons at issue, the reasons at stake, that results in an appearance of arbitrariness that comes about in this theological context. Obedience to God when there's a mystery about God's reasons that leads to this metaphor of slavery, or this language of slavery, to have force. So if we think about this question in the case of Weil in particular, we can recall briefly how she uses the language of slavery. It's a language that she particularly enjoys using, finds illuminating. We find the image of the slave all throughout her thought, at a philosophical level, as she's analyzing slavery as a concept, empirically, as she's describing experiences of workers, of colonial subjects, of war. And we find it as slavery as an aspiration in her thought as well, a desire. Right? As she writes, quote, "There's a desire to empty ourselves of the world, to take the form of a slave." She writes elsewhere, "The slave is in a sense a model. Slavery is an image of obedience to God. And in contemplation, the right relationship with God is love. In action, it is slavery." She contrasts citizenship and legal regimes tied to the state with the sense of obedience that comes about in slavery, which is mixed with caprice, subject to time, forcing us to wait. And she contrasts slavery favorably with a sense of citizenship. But there's also in Weil here a desire for a reversal, a sense that we must realize we're all slaves, and we should desire to become a different sort of slave. Once we were enslaved to the beast, now we should desire to be enslaved to necessity or to God. Practices like factory work, which underscore that sense of slavery, can affect this transformation, as Weil writes. There in the factory I received forever the mark of a slave. Since then I have always regarded myself as a slave. There's a realization of this status of all humans as slaves. And once that realization happens, then one can sort of affirm one's status as slave. And that opens up these theological possibilities. Christianity is appealing to her because she sees it as a religion of slaves, allowing for that reversal. I want to think more carefully with Weil about this figure of the slave, and as she develops it in her famous essay on the Iliad. But first, before doing that, I want to take a bit of a detour through the figure of the slave in recent Black thought. In Black thought of the last decade or so, the slave has become the central character, an anchor, as it were, to discourse around race. Like Weil, there's a sense that recognizing slavery and its legacy and its afterlives makes it possible to embrace an identity as a slave or something like a slave or adjacent to a slave. The discourse that I want to talk about is a dramatic shift in race discourse in the US context. Until 10 years ago, there was a fairly stable way in which public discourse and philosophical discourse on race operated, a style of talk that fell under the umbrella of multiculturalism, embracing difference, acknowledging the difficulties that negotiating difference can have, but ultimately a sort of happy story about different racial communities living together and working toward flourishing and coexistence. With the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, that racial discourse has dramatically shifted. A new way of talking about race and in particular Blackness has emerged, and with it, a whole new vocabulary that includes affirmations of Blackness, of Black love, Black dignity, Black rage, a new not only rhetoric, but moral vocabulary. When thinking about the emergence of this discourse, it's important to note a couple of features. One, that while Black Lives Matter is often represented as a kind of amorphous movement, protests when something happens, it begins on a particular date, July 13th, 2013, after the acquittal in the Trayvon Martin case. One particular person, Alicia Garza on social media, writes a Facebook post, "Black people, I love you, I love us, our lives matter." Her friend Patrice Cullors adds hashtag Black Lives Matter. They realize that something is catching here. They work with their friend Opal Tometi to create some basic infrastructure so that local groups can use the hashtag as an organizing tool, and then it takes on a life of its own, but a life that grows in parallel with that organizing infrastructure that continues to exist and support the political manifestations and protest of the movement. Another important feature of the discourse around Black Lives Matter is that there's a two-way dialogue with theory and with the academy, in part because of the financial crisis and its effect on its politicizing effect on graduate students. There are more and more graduate students, a cohort of graduate students who see their work as speaking to social movements and exist in mediated spaces, for example, social media, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, where there is a flow of ideas and hashtags and quotations and citations from scholarly spaces to activist spaces and back again, because there's a world of those who were in academic spaces, left them, in part because of frustrations with the academy, among others, and now are inhabiting social movement spaces or spaces adjacent to the academy that allow for this really robust flow of ideas that I don't think we've seen in a very long time, a social movement so closely tethered to scholarly discussions in a discipline within the academy, that is the field of Black studies, which makes for a really theoretically robust conversation about what it is that grounds the Black Lives Matter movement and what it is that's distinctive about discourse on anti-Blackness today. And as I already hinted, right, this discourse takes anti-Blackness as its cornerstone and takes slavery as the paradigm of anti-Blackness. Slavery and anti-Blackness are tightly tethered together. Among the ideas that are circulating in these spaces, a sense that work is necessary to get one person to treat another as a thing, right? For slavery to work, to counter the intuitions that humans have about each other's humanity. It was necessary to have more than just a law. One needed intellectual work, emotional work, imaginative work, shaping of reason, shaping of institutions. Right? So much work, in fact, that when laws authorizing slavery cease to exist, the apparatus, this set of emotions, imagination, reason, institutions, persists. And that is what attracts the name anti-Blackness. There's also an attention to slavery as social death, to borrow a popularized slogan from Orlando Patterson, the sense that slavery is severing bonds with the family, with community, with history and the future. These are themes to which we'll see they touch on in a couple of minutes. To offer just a couple of examples of theoretical frameworks that develop in the academy and that migrate into these social mediated spaces and social movement spaces. One, I'll name four. One has to do with the embrace of the figure of the slave. And Frank Wilderson, who wrote a book called Afro-Pessimism, is an example of this embrace of the figure of the slave. Wilderson writes slave with a capital S, thinks about the figure of the slave as a human that is not treated as human, as a non-being, someone who escapes ontology. He argues that this figure of the slave is baked into the metaphysics of the West, both in a broad sense, in the sort of ideas that animate our world, but also in a specific sense, looking at what Kant, Hegel, and others had to say about Africans, and seeing that as a site at which anti-Blackness got baked into this metaphysics. Wilderson claims that Blackness is a constitutive exclusion of modernity. Right? Blackness, and here Blackness equals the figure of the slave, is always there. So there's no hope for progress, hence the name Afro-Pessimism. What one needs is simply an end of the world. That's the only hope. Another set of figures, Saidiya Hartman, Neil Roberts, Fred Moten, embrace a particular version of the figure of the slave, that is the fugitive. The fugitive becomes a happy sign for Blackness escaping slavery, right? But also a paradigm that can describe contemporary Black experience. The fugitivity marks a site of creativity, a site of energy, a site of beauty, whether it is Hartman doing historical recovery work together with the work of imagination, whether it's Neil Roberts working in political theory or Fred Moten working in aesthetics. They all locate sites of fugitivity and laud them. Hortense Spillers is another theorist who now names not the figure of the slave or the fugitive, but the site of the slave ship, the hold of the slave ship, as a site where that holds a possibility for complicating the entanglement of race and gender. Right? In Black bodies are turned to flesh in the hold of the slave ship afterwards. Gender norms are applied by returning to the site of the slave ship. Those post-Middle Passage gender norms can be complicated, and so the nexus of race and gender can be worked. And finally, Achille Mbembe and Abdul Jan Muhammad think about living death as a paradigm of slavery here. Jean Muhammad thinks that what makes Blackness distinctive is its status as subject, as representing subjects who are death-bound, inflecting all of Black life. Mbembe thinks about modern governance as involving power over death, a continual threat of death, not only in the concentration camp, the privileged example in figures like Agamben, but the plantation as an even deeper paradigm, Mbembe suggests. And so Blackness and slavery, again, are at the root of things. So in this recent discussion of the figure of the slave in Black thought, there are two possibilities. One is that slavery is qualitatively different from other forms of harm. And this discourse embraces that in its affirmation of anti-Blackness as different from other forms of racism. Another possibility, which sometimes comes up in this literature, is that slavery is a paradigm of all forms of harm, not qualitatively different, but a crystallization of all forms of harm. We get that a bit with the sense of living death in the plantation that Mbembe and Jean Muhammad talk about. And these two don't seem compatible to me. This is an emerging discourse, and it's not as yet coherent. So to figure out how to grapple with these two different directions, this sense of qualitative difference between the slave and other forms of harm, and paradigm, it's open work to be done, and turning to Weil, I think, can help us, at least help us deepen our questions, focus our interrogations. Simone Weil's famous essay on the Iliad starts by claiming that the hero of the Iliad is really force, but if that's the case, then the hero's journey, according to Weil, is the quest to enslave. If the hero is force and the hero's journey is the quest to enslave. Slave language comes and goes in the text, but the form of slavery is throughout Weil's reflections. We are to witness those fighting a war, the Trojan War, being enslaved by force, and we're to learn something about the human condition through this work of witnessing. What does enslavement mean for Weil in this text? Well, she offers us lots of vivid and compelling language. She writes, for example, force is that which makes a thing of whoever submits to it. Exercised to the extreme, it makes the human being a thing quite literally, that is, a dead body. Someone was there, and the next moment, no one. We have the sense then of living death, of a person becoming a thing, familiar from the Black discussions of slavery. Weil draws our attention to the intense scene of one warrior holding the sword to the neck of another, and claims that in that scene, humanity is lost. The one who has a sword held to his neck cannot reason, cannot feel, cannot hope, cannot act. What makes that person human has been drained. The human becomes a thing in this most intense scene of war. The human becomes a corpse without being touched, just from the threat of death here. Weil writes meditatively, strange being, a thing with a soul, strange situation for the soul. Who can say how it must each moment conform itself, twist and contort itself. It was not created to inhabit a thing. When it compels itself to do so, it endures violence through and through. The status of the person as thing contorts the soul, even when it's just the threat of violence to the body, does violence to the soul. Slavery, it seems, then for Weil, is a paradigm of domination in this text, and it has to do with the capacity to arbitrarily impose one's will on another. That capacity and that arbitrariness are important. So when Weil is reflecting, she writes in notebooks in another text, quote, persons subjected to the arbitrary are suspended in the passage of time. Persons subjected to the arbitrary are suspended in the passage of time. They await the most demeaning of situations, the vicissitudes of the next instant. They passively submit to the present. They do not dispose of their moments. They do not have a lever to affect the future. That arbitrariness, right, sense that at any moment, the force can fall on the one enslaved, right, cuts off the future and also cuts off the past, also cuts off possibilities of sociality, right? Again, draining the humanness from the human. This is a kind of living death, not exactly a corpse, but not exactly a metaphor of a corpse either, something in between. As Weil writes, an alternative human species, a hybrid of man and corpse. My colleague Biko Gray has recently done some interesting work on Afro-pessimism and zombies, arguing that what Afro-pessimists mean by anti-Blackness has to do with the status of human between humanity and non-humanity, and the zombie is a figure that best represents that. It seems like Weil is getting at something very similar here, an alternative human species, a hybrid of man and corpse, a life that death has frozen long before putting an end to it. We respond to the sight of living death as we respond when we see a corpse. We recoil, but then we get used to it and we forget. Before such living corpses, others move about as if they were not there. Right? That initial recoil goes away, and then there's a kind of invisibility. So in this intense moment of war, we have slavery as what results as a paradigm. Then Simone Weil zooms out from that intense moment to the more general experience of war. No longer is there a sword held to the neck, but there's just generalized violence. She suggests that actually it's this uncertainty of violence that enslaves. At any moment, death or violence could come in this context of war. And so that, quote, nullifies the thought of the future and the past. So even in this general, even when there's not a sword on the throat, there's this cutoff from future and past possibilities. That cuts off the sense of obligation to place, of obligation to other people, indeed of obligation to oneself. One's inner life is blotted out in this generalized context of war. Then Weil zooms out still further. Now it's not war, it's not that moment when there is a sword to the neck, but we're everywhere, all around the world, at all times. Weil writes, every human being may at any moment be compelled to submit to force. That image of the sword on the neck moves to generalized violence in a situation of war, moves to the experience of the world as such. This, they suggest, we have a tendency to forget because it's too hard, right? Too hard to think that our experience of the world everywhere is like we have a sword to our neck. It's as if the possibility of death is on top of us at all moments. So we blot it out, we forget, we repress that there's this possibility of death at any moment, that we are all in this warlike context, We imagine that we're free. We imagine that we're at a distance from war. We imagine that we're at a distance from the scene of violence. We experience, as Weil puts it, days empty of necessity, days of play, of dream, whimsical and illusory. But Weil, one who enjoys popping the balloon of happiness in such a context, right, says, in fact, right, we are in a context like that's always warlike. She suggests further that even at the start of a war, right, even when you know you're signing up for something that could lead to death, right, that possibility of death is repressed. It's only it only becomes visible in the heat of the violence. It's so hard to recognize how force enslaves. Then they zooms out still further, so or really shifts perspective. So we zoomed out from that scene of the sword on the neck to the scene of war to the world as such, and now they has us consider, right, those who are wielding force, those who seem like they are the safest, right? They're not at a distance from war. They are the ones who are winning. They are the ones who are holding the sword. And she argues that even those who are wielding force are themselves enslaved. Quote, conquerors and conquered are brothers in the same misery. Force turns all in contact with it to things. There's no way of evading this. And this is where the Iliad is particularly illustrative. The Iliad is illustrative in the depiction of violence, in its gruesomeness, in its pervasiveness, but also, right, in the speed at which it turns the tables, in the way in which it shows how the strong and weak falsely believe that they are a different species, but actually are, again, brothers in the same misery. Chance or fate is essential. We can't control what is, who will be the victor next. And so we are reminded that we are all in this context of, in this warlike context, we are all, again, enslaved. So there's here not only a descriptive claim about us all being enslaved through this analysis of the Iliad, but also that hints at a normative claim, an embrace of the figure of the slave, not, interestingly, the figure of the fugitive, because there's no escape, right, for Weil. So embracing the figure of the fugitive, as some corners of Black thought might suggest, would not be useful, but the figure of the slave itself is the figure to which Weil turns for a kind of ethical vision. And once that figure is embraced, once one realizes that one is in this position as slave, then we can appreciate the moments, the small moments that interrupt enslavement by force and point to something else. Those moments of self-reflection or introspection that interrupt the workings of force, the warlike condition of the world, small moments of love of different kinds that interrupt that working of war. This has ethical implications not only in the embrace of the moments in the life of the slave that interrupt that bad sort of slavery, but also much more practically in Weil's analysis of colonialism. Right? For Weil, colonialism is another case of slavery. And here, some important questions come up about the power of the metaphor, to what extent she's leaning on a metaphor to make a point. Tunisia, for example, she describes as a, quote, abyss of slavery. She has similar language when talking about Southeast Asia, French colonies. Right? It's not an abyss of slavery because of the conditions of the culture there. It's an abyss of slavery because of the structure of domination that colonialism is. She describes colonialism as a process that is exactly the same as war, with one difference: there are no weapons, but the structure remains the same. Indeed, she writes, quote, colonization nearly always begins by the exercise of force in its purest form, that is, by conquest. A people overcome through force of arms suddenly has to submit to the control of foreigners of another color, another language, a completely different culture, and convinced of their own superiority. Now, in sum, it seems as though Weil is claiming two different things. One, that we are all slaves, and two, that colonization and war are special examples of slavery. Now, this sense of a special example is deeply ambiguous, and one that I think is worth reflecting on. Are these paradigms? Are these examples? Are these different species of slavery? How do these two claims fit together? We are all slaves, and there are these two especially clear examples of slavery. Thinking now about Weil, next to this tradition of reflection of slavery and Black thought, I offer a series of reflections and further questions and complications rather than conclusions. It seems that in the case of Weil, there is a quantitative difference between slavery as such, slavery proper, and slavery in the broad sense. It seems like there's a question of intensity, right? Colonization and war have more of this stuff, more of this slavery stuff, whatever quality it has, it is more of the quantity of the thing in those cases. It seems in the case of Black thought that there's a qualitative difference at work. Slavery is qualitatively different from other forms of harm. Anti-Blackness is qualitatively different from other forms of racism because of the distinctive history, because of the depth, the metaphysical dimension that attaches to anti-Black slavery in this form of anti-Blackness, and because of the set of feelings, institutions, imagination that are all wrapped up in slavery. So there's a qualitative difference. And yet this doesn't seem quite right to mark Weil as thinking in terms of quantitative difference and Black thought thinking in terms of qualitative difference. Because they both proceed through the same structure of argument. They're looking at laboratory conditions. Right? They're trying to find a case where we find in its clearest this example, this thing that is slavery. Right? The Middle Passage seems to mark in the clearest way possible this thing that is slavery, the complete severing of past culture, family ties that one doesn't get in other forms of harm. For Weil, in the moment of the sword on the throat, one gets laboratory conditions of enslavement. All reason, all feeling, all imagination are purged in that moment. One goes from laboratory conditions into the real world in both cases. And in that passage from laboratory conditions to the real world, questions arise, right? At what moment does one say, you've drifted too far from the paradigm case, that it's no longer slavery, it no longer applies? It seems like there's a gray area, right? A gradation in both cases, Weil and Black thought, if that's the structure of the argument, identifying the paradigm case and then moving away from it. And of course, even laboratory conditions aren't perfect, right? Even in the laboratory, one is making approximations, one is imagining what things would be like. a second concluding reflection. Is Weil's sense of slavery Homeric? It doesn't seem like it, right? She doesn't really claim to be doing history, or maybe she presents herself as having historical knowledge, but many readers of Weil and many classicists have pointed out that this is not really the Homeric world that she's looking at. Right? So what is the sense of slavery that she's finding in the Iliad? Well, it seems very much informed by a tradition of Western political thought that takes slavery and something a lot like Black slavery as its paradigm, right? This sense of the capacity of one to arbitrarily exercise one's will over another, the severing of kinship, of past, of culture. If they is actually projecting something like Black slavery onto the Homeric context, right? In her search for laboratory conditions, in her search for a pure paradigm, then wouldn't it be more useful to use the paradigm of the Middle Passage? Might there be works of literature? I think yesterday Inez Radzin suggested Toni Morrison's Beloved. Might there be works of literature that allow for Weil to pursue her project, to pursue her goals, even more clearly if they were reflecting on the Middle Passage? The third concluding reflection here has to do with the critic's task and the ethical response. For Weil, modernity conceals slavery in its rhetoric of equality and rights. It seems as if we're all, as if slavery is no longer an aspect of the world, but in fact, by reflecting on the Iliad, one can see that slavery is still ubiquitous. Weil takes it as her task to name that slavery that is just behind the curtain, as it were. Similarly, in the discourse around Black Lives Matter, there's a frustration with the discourse of the post-racial, right? A sense that the language of race or Blackness no longer has force, that at most, Blackness could be reduced to one form of racial difference, which is one form of difference among others, which can all be happily managed, and so that we can live a happy, diverse life in flourishing community. But this discourse around Black Lives Matter is trying to point out that behind that veneer of something like equality and diversity, there is slavery. Right? Slavery is still present. Slavery is still acting. Slavery is still a paradigm that's exercising its force on our world. So for both Weil and this tradition of Black thought, there's a pulling back the curtains and finding slavery and embracing the figure of the slave. Right? For the case of, in the case of Weil and in the case of Black thought, that leads to kind of ethical prescription. For Weil, the figure of the slave offers access to the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so implicitly, if not explicitly, in this tradition of Black thought, by embracing the slave or the fugitive, one can have clarity about goodness, have greater clarity about truth, can appreciate the beautiful and perform the beautiful. Saidiya Hartman's wonderful book is called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, very much along these lines. But what counts as sharing in that experience of the slave? Right? If we're thinking in terms of gradations from the paradigm case, is the desire to approach the paradigm case in order to have access to this good, the true, and the beautiful? It seems like at times Weil is suggesting that in her embrace of labor and factory work. But in the Black case, there seems to be a limit, right? Can one become Black, right, to experience this access to the good, the true, and the beautiful that comes with the legacy of slavery? It seems unclear and troubling and problematic. Right? Is there a gradation, right, that one wants to move toward Blackness, move toward Black slavery in order to get better access to the good, the true, and the beautiful? This is a puzzle that I don't have an answer to, but that Black theologians have been thinking a good deal about. Right? The question of what it means to convert to Blackness is a central question in Black theological discourse. And it's a question that wrestles with paradox. But of course, paradox is at the very root of Christian theology. It's at the root of Weil's thought. And I believe that deeper dialogue between Weil's thought and Black theology can deepen our response to these perplexing issues. Thank you so much.